Good evening, traveler. I'm so glad you've come. My name is Duncan. I was born in the year 1592, and I have lived ever since. More than 4 centuries have passed through me, like seasons through an old oak tree. I have watched cities rise and crumble. I have listened to the breath of empires and sat quietly in the gardens of forgotten queens. I have known painters, explorers, dreamers, and dancers. I have walked with the brilliant and stood beside the heartbroken. And now I tell stories, not to dazzle you, not to teach, but to help you rest. Because after 400 years of listening, I've learned that sometimes a gentle voice and a good story can be the softest pillow of all. This channel is my little candle in the dark, a quiet place to drift, to wonder, to fall slowly into sleep, wrapped in stories. If this kind of storytelling brings you comfort, I gently invite you to subscribe and tap the bell so that the next time your eyes grow heavy, a story might find you just in time. And if there's something you'd like to hear, a name from history, a question long forgotten, leave me a note in the comments. I may have been there. I may remember. Now, turn off the light. Lay your head down. Let your breath settle. Unclench your jaw. Soften your eyes. Let the weight of the day melt into the quiet. You're safe here. And tonight, I want to take you to a garden, one not hidden in fairy tales, but tucked just outside Paris, a place where roses once bloomed with imperial precision, and where silence was shared like fine tea. You see, a long time ago, when I had grown tired of the noise of cities and courts, I became a gardener. Not just anywhere, but at Malmaison, the private estate of Empress Josephine Bonaparte. She had already been cast aside by Napoleon, yet she remained, to me, the most fascinating woman in France. And while I was there, tending roses, trimming lilacs, she would sometimes wander into the garden where I worked. She thought of me as quiet company, and over many mornings and evenings, she spoke, not like an empress, but like someone remembering a life made of gullery and loneliness, of beauty and loss. And what she told me then, in those quiet hours between the wars and the pages of history, is what I want to share with you now. So rest your head and listen. This is the story of Joséphine. It began with the sound of shears clipping lavender. That's how my mornings often started at Malmaison. There, beneath the gauzy light of dawn, I would tend the beds along the eastern walk, brushing dew from roses, listening to the birds negotiate their melodies. The house, still quiet behind me, slept like a queen retired from her court. That was Josephine's world in those years, not a palace of mirrors or marble, but of blossoms and breezes and slow mornings with no generals in sight. She had been Empress once, and yet, when I met her, that title felt as though it belonged to someone else entirely. She wore it like a memory, not a crown. I was her gardener then, one of several, but I had a habit of not speaking unless spoken to. A habit she seemed to notice. She liked to walk near the herb rows, lavender, rosemary, mint. She would reach out and brush her fingers lightly across the tops of the plants, as if reminding them of her presence. And then, sometimes, she would speak, not formally, not in declarations, but softly, like someone brushing dust off old porcelain. "I never liked Versailles," she once said, without context. "All that velvet made people forget how to feel the wind." Take a moment to absorb that. A woman who had worn silks and sat beside an emperor, finding more truth in a gust of garden wind than in all the powdered salons of Paris. That was Joséphine. History remembers her as an ornament to Napoleon. But let me offer a different portrait, not of jewels and diplomacy, but of a woman sitting barefoot in the grass behind the house, shucking peas into a bowl, telling stories to no one in particular. She had grown up on the island of Martinique. There were moments when the heat rose in the French countryside that I could see something change in her face, as if the flowers around her were whispering in Creole. She told me once that in her youth, she thought Paris was just a fairy tale people used to make little girls behave. And yet, the fairy tale became real and cruel and dazzling and fleeting. When she married Napoleon, she was older than him by 6 years, already a mother, already a widow, a survivor of the revolution, quite literally. Her first husband was guillotined. She had nearly been, too. But she spoke of that time like one might speak of a storm seen from far off, not with fear, but with awe. She never bragged, never corrected, but there was steel behind the softness. And if you listened long enough, in the way that I, with centuries behind me, had learned to listen, you could hear it. One morning, as she watched a blackbird dip into the fountain, she said, "I think the trouble with being loved too much is that people stop believing you have thoughts of your own." Then she smiled and added, "But that never stopped me from having them." It's easy to forget that Empress Josephine was more than just Napoleon's wife. She was an art collector, a patron of botanists, and, quietly, one of the most influential tastemakers in Europe. And yet, she seemed most at ease barefoot in the grass. Let that image stay with you, because tonight's story is not about power. It's about presence and what remains when the crowns and titles have faded into memory. Her fate, as history calls it, was not sealed in a battle or a treaty. It was lived out gently, like the final bloom of a summer rose, not loudly, but completely. And perhaps that's why she told me her stories. Because I didn't ask, I just listened. And because, in her garden, she was not a symbol. She was simply someone who had once lived at the heart of the world, and now simply lived. I remember one evening, she touched a rosebud that hadn't opened yet and whispered, "Everything is so quiet before it begins, even heartbreak." And in that moment, I realized something. She wasn't just reminiscing. She was teaching, not with lessons, but with pauses. And now, as we step further into her story, I invite you to notice the small things, the softness between sentences, the space between the past and the present. Because Joséphine lived there, in those spaces. And that's where our story begins. Napoleon once wrote to her, "I awake all filled with you. The memory of last night has left no rest to my senses." But she did not answer right away. She rarely did. It was not cruelty. It was rhythm. And Joséphine understood rhythm. The space between words, the breath between sentences. She moved to it like a dancer who'd long ago left the stage, but still heard the music in her bones. By the time they met, he was not yet emperor, not even consul, just a rising star from Corsica, brimming with volcanic ambition. She, on the other hand, had seen revolutions, not just political ones, but personal. She had endured prison, poverty, survival. Napoleon fell first, and hard. He flooded her with letters, not formal declarations, but torrents, wild, possessive, pleading, at times even desperate. "I don't love you. I adore you," he wrote. "I am jealous of everyone who talks to you, looks at you, walks near you." And still, she replied with gentleness, measured, almost amused, as though love, for her, was not a fever, but a climate. Take a moment with that, because this is where their story becomes something more than romantic. It becomes human. To Napoleon, she was the anchor. To her, he was the storm. And perhaps that's why their union was so powerful and so fragile. He sought eternity. She offered presents. There's a kind of melancholy in reading their letters now, not because of what they contain, but because of what they reveal. How even the grandest love can never promise perfect symmetry. Napoleon was gone for long stretches. Italy, Egypt, campaigns that turned into legends. And Joséphine remained in Paris, navigating salons, entertaining guests, living in a world that was both glittering and uncertain. She wore the city like perfume, lightly, but with memory. She made mistakes, of course, affairs whispered about, encounters never quite confirmed, the kind that court historians like to list in margins. But love, real love, is never a clean account. It is flawed, imperfect, alive. She once said, not to Napoleon, but in quiet confidence to a friend, "I never expected to be adored like a goddess, only not to be feared like a ghost." That sentence stayed with me, because when you've lived as long as I have, you begin to see how the deepest connections are often the ones least visible to the outside world. They're not found in proclamations or coronations, but in how someone looks at another across a quiet room. And it was in rooms like those that their marriage breathed, softly, sometimes painfully, but still it breathed. When Napoleon returned from Egypt, he was thinner, darker around the eyes, changed. And when he discovered her infidelity, or what he believed to be infidelity, his fury was volcanic. But here's the strange, almost tender irony. In anger, he still wrote to her, still called her my Joséphine, still dreamed of her scent. What does that tell us? That love, even wounded, wants to speak, even if the words come in fire. They reconciled, of course. He could never fully leave her. And when he became emperor, he placed the crown gently upon her head, even though the church preferred otherwise. He needed her there, as a symbol, as a presence, as his beginning. Yet even then, even in all her robes and titles, I think Joséphine knew something deeper, that being loved and being chosen are not always the same thing. And still, she stayed. Not out of duty, but grace. There's a kind of wisdom in that, a quiet power. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was something more complicated, more human. And perhaps that's why it endured, even after it ended. Because, yes, they would part, but not in this moment, not yet. For now, their love was still a letter being written, ink still wet, paper still breathing, and Joséphine was still listening. The year was 1804. The stones of Notre Dame were cold, ancient, and solemn. watching silently as the world shifted within their walls. This was no ordinary day in Paris. The air itself seemed to hum with something beyond ceremony, something old, and something entirely new. It was December, and yet the cathedral glowed warm with candlelight and velvet. Drums murmured, trumpets held their breath, and at the center of it all stood Joséphine, draped in imperial silk, her hands folded as if in silent prayer. She looked serene. But I remember thinking, even from my place near the edge of the nave, that she understood what this moment truly meant. She had worn many titles: widow, survivor, lover, wife. Now, another was being written for her: Empress. But even titles, even crowns, do not rewrite the past. They only illuminate it. She had come far, but not in the way that stories of ambition usually suggest. Josephine's path had never been one of conquest. It was the art of endurance, of navigating tides instead of breaking through them. And on that day, that gilded, breathless day, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands, turned, and placed it himself upon Josephine's head, not as a formality, but as a gesture. She had once crowned him with her presence. Now he returned the favor with gold. It was a moment steeped in pageantry, but also in something more delicate, a kind of reverence. Take a moment to let that settle in your thoughts. A man whose name would reshape Europe, whose shadow would stretch across continents, paused to place a crown upon the head of a woman who had once sent him perfumed letters from her garden. Yet power, like perfume, fades, not at once, but with the subtlety of dusk. And as the empire grew louder, Joséphine began to retreat into quieter spaces, not in bitterness, but in recognition. Her realm had never been the battlefield. It was the drawing room, the garden, the measured grace of social diplomacy. At Malmaison, her country estate just outside Paris, she created a world unlike any palace, a sanctuary of orchids and hummingbirds, paintings and parlor music, where generals might lay down their swords and scientists sip tea beside painters. There was, in Joséphine, a quiet understanding that empires are fragile, but atmospheres endure. She filled her conservatories with rare flowers. Some whispered she talked to them. Perhaps she did. She had, after all, learned how to bloom where others withered. Napoleon, ever marching forward, did not always notice the subtle distance growing between them. Not in affection, that lingered, but in trajectory. He wanted a dynasty. She could no longer bear children. And though their bond remained tender, familiar, and layered with shared memory, the crown she wore began to grow heavy with silence. I remember an evening at Malmaison, long after the coronation, when she offered me a glass of wine beneath the glass dome of her greenhouse. The moonlight poured through the panes, and somewhere in the background, a harp was playing. She said, almost absently, "You know, crowns are like chandeliers. Brilliant, yes, but you must stand very still beneath them." We both laughed, but I knew what she meant. Joséphine was never naive. She understood the politics behind affection, and she saw what was coming, not in a single moment, but in the slow, inevitable rhythm of change. Still, she never fought it. That was her brilliance. She did not cling to the past. She cultivated it. Each guest at Malmaison, each rare bloom, each letter from a friend, became a kind of quiet resistance to the noise of history. She had once been Rose. Now she was Empress Josephine. And soon she would be something else entirely. But not yet. Not while the orchids bloomed. Not while the candles flickered in the salons. Not while Napoleon still paused, even briefly, at the mention of her name. Because names, once written in history, can never truly be erased. And some are etched in perfume and crowned in silence. Let this moment linger. The crown is still warm, the garden still breathing, and the story still unfolding. The palace was hushed that afternoon. Not silent, exactly. The fire still crackled, and outside the windows, Paris whispered as always. But inside, something had settled, something not quite sorrow, and not quite peace. It was the day they would end their marriage, not with shouts, not with betrayal, but with a signature. It was not easy. It was never meant to be. But like the turning of a season, it had become inevitable. Napoleon wanted an heir. The empire, now a swelling thing of laws and maps and futures, demanded continuity. Joséphine had given him everything she could, everything but a child. And though her presence still warmed his breath, and though he still paused when saying her name, he knew. And so did she. There are moments in history where the world pivots quietly, not at the clash of swords, but in the hush of two people acknowledging that love is not always enough. Take a moment with that. It's not an easy truth, but it is a real one. They had come through revolutions together, through passion, distance, reconciliation, and crowned glory. But now the path curved, and they stood for the last time at its parting. Joséphine agreed to the divorce, not because she was weak, but because she was wise. She had always understood the empire almost better than the man who ruled it. And perhaps she understood love, too. That sometimes the truest form of affection is release. She left the Tuileries on a soft winter morning, not in disgrace, not in bitterness, but in grace. The city did not jeer. The court did not erupt. And Napoleon, even in the weeks that followed, was said to have walked more slowly through the rooms they once shared. There are those who say he cried, perhaps. But whether he did or not, something changed in him. Joséphine returned to Malmaison, to the house she had filled with light and lemon trees, to her books, her orchids, her quiet salons. And in that retreat, she did not disappear. She expanded, or perhaps returned. For in leaving the stage, she stepped fully into herself. There is a kind of strength rarely spoken about in the stories of empires, the strength to yield, to step down with dignity, to bow not out of defeat, but out of timing. She still wrote letters, still received artists and scientists, still kept Napoleon's portrait near her desk, though she never remarked upon it when guests visited. He wrote to her, too, even after his remarriage to Marie-Louise of Austria. He still called her Joséphine, never my former wife, never the past, simply Joséphine. And that tells us something. That love, once it matures past possession, can become something even more rare, remembrance without bitterness. Sometimes I think their marriage was never truly undone, not in spirit, only in form. Because how else do you explain that even in exile, years later, Napoleon's final words would include her name? He had ruled continents, but in his last breath, he thought of the garden at Malmaison, of her voice, of the woman who had once soothed his fiercest storms, not with argument, but with presence. Let that settle in you. In a world that measures worth by noise, Joséphine gave him quiet, and that quiet endured. Long after the parades faded, long after the crown passed to other hands, long after they parted, there's a particular kind of legacy she left, not written in stone or carved on coins, but in memory, in tone, in a way of being that whispers still, through gardens, through portraits, through letters sealed with wax. And though she left the palace, she did not leave history. She became, in a way, its pulse. The empress who stepped aside, but never away. There are palaces that rise from stone and command the horizon. And there are those, like Malmaison, that seem to grow from the soil itself. Nestled just west of Paris, this was not a royal residence in the grand sense. No endless marble halls or vast thrones. No gold ceilings whispering of conquest. But here, Joséphine was truly at home. She returned to Malmaison not in defeat, but with something rare and remarkable, a quiet sense of purpose. Gone was the rhythm of official court life, the urgency, the appearances, the ceaseless parade of power's performance. In its place came a deeper rhythm of roots, of ink on paper, of petals unfolding at dawn. Malmaison became her world, and it was a world unlike any other in Europe. In these gardens, Joséphine found a new identity, not as the former Empress of the French, but as something more elemental, a curator of life. She collected not people now, but plants. She wrote letters not as diplomacy, but as conversation. She surrounded herself not with politicians, but with botanists, poets, and musicians. And still, the house was never lonely. It thrummed with gentle energy, like the low, reassuring hum of bees moving from flower to flower under a drowsy sun. She had the glass house rebuilt and expanded. Inside bloomed over 200 species of roses, camellias from Japan, narcissus from North Africa, even a delicate hibiscus from the colonies. Some said she was obsessed, but perhaps she had simply learned what too few ever do, that to tend to life in its smallest, most intricate forms is no less noble than ruling it. Joséphine wrote detailed notes on her plants, sometimes in the margins of her personal books. She consulted with explorers, sponsored voyages, and requested seeds and specimens from lands few in France had even heard of. Malmaison became a living atlas, a sanctuary of the faraway. And to walk its paths with her was to travel the globe without ever leaving the stillness of the garden. She once said to me with a wry smile, "I used to admire men who chased the world. Now I think the world chases beauty, and beauty stays still." Take a moment to sit with that thought. She had, in her own way, become a kind of philosopher, not in argument, but in arrangement. In her home, each vase was placed with intention, each color chosen to balance, not dominate. Even her wardrobe shifted. Soft silks, earth tones, comfortable elegance, a style no longer meant to impress, but to reflect. She received visitors, still, statesmen, ambassadors, even Napoleon's new wife on one occasion. But there was no rivalry in her tone, no bitterness in her posture, only serenity. And when children visited, and many did, for her grandchildren often came to stay, she would show them how to press flowers into books or sketch butterflies on parchment. One child later recalled, "Grandmother Joséphine taught me that silence has a texture, and that some places carry a kind of breath." Malmaison truly did. Even Napoleon, in the years of his unraveling, sent word from exile requesting updates on the garden. He asked if the magnolias still bloomed, if the parrots still nested in the citrus trees, if Joséphine ever thought of him. She did, but not with regret. In her letters, she called him simply Bonaparte, a name before the empire, a name before the titles. And though she never remarried, she seemed content in her solitude. It was, perhaps, the first time in her life that she belonged to no one but herself. There is something quietly radical about that, to belong wholly, peacefully, to one's own hours, to one's own rhythm. When the weather was fine, she would walk alone at dawn through the dewy grass, a servant trailing behind, discreetly, in case she grew tired. But she rarely did. She would often stop beneath the old cedar tree by the lily pond and stand quite still, as if listening to a thought she had not yet fully formed. This was Joséphine's true empire, not carved by treaties, but cultivated by attention, by patience, by an understanding that presence, real, uncluttered presence, is its own kind of power. She did not give grand speeches in her later years. She didn't need to. The garden spoke for her. And those who visited, even those who arrived in haste or status, left quieter, slower, a little softer. So, if you picture Joséphine now, don't imagine her on a throne. Imagine her by the pond, hands lightly clasped, eyes resting not on what was lost, but on what still lived. She had once been Empress of the French, but now she had become something rarer, a woman at peace with her story. Let that truth bloom gently in your thoughts. The roses still remember her, and in their chillant unfolding each spring, they whisper her name in a language older than empire. Long after the parades had faded, after the maps were redrawn and thrones shifted beneath the weight of history, Malmaison remained, not unchanged, for time, like ivy, gently touches all things, but intact in spirit. Joséphine had passed away in 1814, shortly before Napoleon's first exile. But it did not feel, to those who had known her, like a disappearance, more like a soft vanishing into the fabric of the place she had loved. there is something curious about certain souls. They don't leave the world. They settle into it, like sunlight absorbed into old stone. And so it was with her. Her roses continued to bloom long after her final breath. The parrots still nested in the citrus groves, and the wind that curled through the long corridors of Malmaison seemed to carry, now and then, the faintest perfume of jasmine, though none had been planted that season. Visitors said the house felt inhabited, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by presence, a sense of calm, of welcome, of gentle order. Perhaps that was her true legacy, not as the empress who once wore silk and diamonds beside an emperor, but as a woman who knew how to leave behind a space that made others feel at ease. She was not buried with kings, not under domes or carved arches. She rests in the quiet cemetery of Rueil, beneath simple stone, beneath real earth. And yet, in a curious reversal, it was her memory, not her title, that would go on to shape something deeper than dynasty. Napoleon returned from exile, briefly, brilliantly, then was gone again, this time for good. And in his final days, on the remote island of St. Helena, surrounded by wind and waves and memory, he was said to have spoken 5 final words. France, the army, the head of the army, Joséphine. Not my second wife, not his generals, not even his own victories, but her, the one who had walked beside him before the empire, before the crown, the one who had loved him not for his power, but for his need. What does that tell us? Take a moment with this, that even the greatest architects of war, the most forceful makers of destiny, in their quietest hour, do not summon the clang of glory. They summon a hand they once held in silence. They summon kindness. And maybe that is what Joséphine left behind, more than any title or estate. An atmosphere, a way of being remembered without demanding remembrance. Today, historians trace her influence through fashion, through botany, through the elegance she helped define during one of the most turbulent periods in European memory. But you and I, we can trace it another way, in the intangible, in the spaces she filled, then left filled, in how she is still spoken of, not with awe, but with affection. There is something quietly revolutionary in that. After all, her rise had not been predicted. Born on a distant island, widowed once, nearly imprisoned once, she was never meant to stand at the center of the world. And yet, for a time, the world turned more gracefully because she was there. She made palaces feel like homes, made rulers pause, made silence meaningful. Even long after her death, portraits of her remained in private salons, not because they represented power, but because they carried a mood, a calm, a face that suggested the world could be held more gently. She is not a figure often taught in war rooms or dissected in diplomatic archives, but in museums and in rose gardens and in the quiet afternoon light of Malmaison's old salon, you still find her. A presence, not a monument, a murmur, not a proclamation. And perhaps that is the most lasting kind of legacy. To be remembered not for what you ruled, but for what you tended. Not for what you changed by force, but for what you nurtured by attention. So the next time you find yourself in a quiet garden, or leafing through an old book where petals have been pressed between pages, or noticing how light glows in a still room just before evening, you may feel it. That trace of Joséphine, not loud, but unmistakable. The empress who left no empire behind her, only a hush, a garden, and a name that still echoes when history forgets to shout. Some lives do not end with a final act. They dissolve gently, like perfume on a silk scarf, or sunlight fading across a stone floor. And in that gentle ending, something remains, not loud, not grand, but deeply, unmistakably human. They say that history forgets those who do not win. And yet, some names linger, not because of crowns or victories, but because they touched the world differently. When I think of Joséphine, it's not the empress I remember. It's not the glitter of coronations or the rustle of courtly gowns. It's the early mornings at Malmaison, when the mist still clung to the grass, and she walked alone through the garden paths, her fingers brushing over damp leaves as if greeting old friends. There was something reverent in the way she moved through nature, not as its master, but as its kin. The world had taken much from her, her youth in Martinique lost to distance, her first husband lost to the guillotine, her marriage to Napoleon lost to necessity. And yet, she gave back. She gave beauty, grace, warmth. In the final years of her life, I watched her become quieter, not with sadness, but with peace. She knew, I think, that not all legacies wear medals. Some bloom in soil, some sing through birdsong, some whisper through time. She asked me once, kneeling near a bed of irises, "Do you think the world will remember me, Duncan?" And I, brushing soil from my hands, said, "It already does, madame. In every place where something lovely was once broken, and then made to bloom again." She smiled at that, not with pride, but with a kind of tired affection, the smile of someone who has come to terms with her story. She died quietly. No crowds, no drums, only her children by her side, and a garden in bloom just outside her window. Spring was returning. Years passed, and more. Empires fell. Names changed. Napoleon went to Elba, and then to St. Helena. The world spun on. But Malmaison, it breathed her still. The peacocks still strutted by the ponds. The greenhouse trembled with the scent of orchids and old air. And her roses, oh, the roses, still opened their petals toward the morning light, as if she might return with her shears and her stories and her gentle humming. Take a moment to breathe here, to imagine the stillness of that place, the peace of a woman who had lost an empire but never lost herself. And now, dear listener, the story rests. You've walked with me through the fragrant hours of her memory. You've heard not the tale of power, but of presence, not of conquest, but of cultivation. Before we part tonight, I ask only this: remember her not for her crown, but for her garden, not for what she ruled, but for what she nurtured. If this story has settled gently over you, if it's brought you warmth or softness or rest, I hope you'll return. I have many more stories to share, from centuries of wandering, of artists and thinkers, of kings and dreamers, and sometimes of quiet women who changed the world with roses. But for now, turn your pillow, close your eyes, and let the garden remain.